Hey everyone, welcome back. Today our final screencast on Chapter 19 is going to focus on the closing of the frontier. And this is really kind of the end of an era here in American history. We've always kind of, throughout the beginning part of our class, we've always kind of had this West that was kind of looking towards the future, somewhere to move towards, somewhere to expand upon, this manifest destiny, to reach from sea to shining sea. And really kind of in this time period, after the Civil War, the late 1800s, the frontier is going to close, and it's going to be kind of an ending of a big era in American history. And so that's really what we're going to focus on here, and what the meaning behind the closing of the frontier really is for America. Now, this concept known as the open range, this is going to kind of characterize the western part of the country, west of the Mississippi, um, prior to the Civil War, and then also a little bit after the Civil War. And what this means is that the West was basically a wide open wilderness. It's not fenced in. People do not have their individual plots of land. It's very much an open range type situation. And as far as some terms that you might know, like a ranger and a cowboy, are going to kind of come about at this time because the range kind of refers to just this place. It's kind of like a farm, but it's an open range where you kind of keep cattle, you keep livestock, and you're going to drive them up north to be slaughtered. And so the cowboy really develops in the pre-Civil War era and then blossoms kind of during the Civil War and after the Civil War. And so this is where you kind of get, again, like I brought up in the first screencast, this cowboy and Indian notion that the West is kind of like the wild, wild West, and you got the cowboys out there, and they're fighting against the Indians. And in a sense, it's correct. It is kind of the wild, wild West. The federal government is not a strong presence out there. The cowboys are out there on the open range, herding their cattle, taking care of their cattle, driving them up north to places like Kansas for them to be slaughtered and then taken east. And it is kind of this lawless place in a lot of ways because the eastern government, Washington, is so far away that they do kind of make their own laws out there. And this is kind of where this whole fantasy of the West comes from. Now, some of the famous things. So where were the rangers and where were they kind of driving people? There's a few famous trails. The most famous trail is the Chisholm Trail, and this most of the range comes from, or where most of where the cattle was raised is in Texas. So there's a reason that, for example, like the Texas Rangers, the baseball team, they're called the Rangers because of what Texas used to be famous for. Texas was famous for, their cattle, and then later on their oil and a few different things. And so they're going to raise their cattle down there, and they're going to drive them north along this trail, the Chisholm Trail, across at that time across Indian territory, up to the final destination of the railroads, which is really where the railroads ended at that time, for the most part, until the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. And then they're going to be either in the beginning actually herded onto the cattle cars and taken as a full herd eastward into the big cities to be slaughtered on the spot. But then after Gustavus Swift invents the refrigerated car, then they're going to be slaughtered right there in Kansas and taken eastward. So I like this stuff because you get to kind of know a lot of traditions about why certain places are known for certain things. So like for example, Texas is known for having cowboys, and if you look at their sports teams, the Rangers, the Cowboys, they used to have a team called the Houston Oilers, all named after their traditions. Kansas City is famous for its great barbecue. And so the reason it's famous for its great barbecue is because basically Kansas was like the slaughterhouse of America for 50 years, and that's where all the cattle were driven. And so they had these great barbecue joints, and they still kind of have them today. So there's some other famous trails that are out there, like the Shawnee Trail and a few other ones. But what the big thing to understand here is that they're driving them across open territory. There's not a lot of private property because if you think about it, what person is going to let you drive, 1 million heads of cattle across their land and destroy their land and then, do it every single year? It's just not going to happen. So you have big open ranges where the cowboys kind of work together to uh, raise the cattle and then drive them up north to these places like Kansas. Now, who are these cowboys? Couple different people, a couple different types of people are going to be cowboys. The majority of cowboys actually are going to be ex-Southerners, ex-Confederate soldiers, about 75% of them. So, there's a reason why we associate cowboys with Texas and places like that, because a lot of them are coming from these states, on these western states. And after the Civil War, instead of going back home to their desolate, demolished South, they're going to stay out west and they're going to become cowboys and work on the ranges and drive cattle north. Now, a lesser group that we don't really talk about, there is a substantial amount of black cowboys at the time too. So these newly freed men in the South are going to say, okay, let's go west, kind of like the exodusters who wanted to go to Kansas. Except they're not going to go out there to settle, they're going to go out there to work and to be cowboys and rangers. So it's about a 75%, 25% breakdown. 75% are going to be white, mostly Southerners, ex-Confederates, and then 25% are going to be black, either coming from the North, from the Union Army and coming down there and becoming cowboys, or newly freed men. And you also kind of have Mexicans who, remember, they're the original inhabitants of the Southwest as far as European powers are concerned, and they're also going to be play a major role as far as cowboys and driving cattle in this environment out here in the West. Now, eventually, this whole concept of the open range and kind of the West is kind of like an open grazing land, like this great grassland for cattle to graze on with not being fenced in. It doesn't last forever. And they're going to have a kind of a closing off of the range here. And this is going to kind of usher in a change in the way that the West develops and what the West was like. And to me, this kind of reminds me, you guys are all students of global history too. You all took it last year, and some of you were in AP Global, so you learned it in some real depth. And this reminds me of the Enclosure Movement in England, where in England you kind of have the estates being enclosed and closed off, and it leaves a lot of workers landless, and that kind of drives them to the cities. And this is really what develops the Industrial Revolution in England. So in America, it's a little bit different because you don't have tons of people living on this land. So they're going to enclose it, and the reason that they enclose it, a big reason is to try and attract people to come live there, to give them individual plots of land. They want the West to be settled by people because they don't want the West, the same thing that happened to the Mexicans in the West, to happen to America. If you remember back to the Mexican-American War centered around Texas, is that they were trying to attract Americans to come settle there, and because they couldn't get anybody to live in this territory, and since it was so sparsely populated, Americans soon outnumbered the Mexicans in the territory. And so I think the American government, part of what they're thinking is we have to kind of get this place settled. Maybe there are too many Indians out there. They might become a force in the future, or whatever their thinking is. They want the land settled there. Some for profit to make some money off of selling it, and then also just to kind of have the West developed and settled. So they passed a series of acts. So the Homestead Act, which I think is one of the coolest acts in American history, of 1862, is they're giving land away. 160-acre plots to go out there and to settle the West. So these people are known as the homesteaders, who go out and settle the West here. So some really cool stories about this would be like, for example, Oklahoma, which used to be the Indian reservation. Remember, the Indians are being pushed further and further west. So with Oklahoma, they kind of had like a race to you could just go there and you could just claim a plot of land. And it was a day. Nobody was allowed to go into Oklahoma beforehand, and they kind of like rang a bell, almost like a race, and you had to get out there and try and claim the best land. And so that's why, for example, the Oklahoma basketball team, they're called the Oklahoma Sooners, because the sooner you got there, the better piece of land you got. And so this is kind of like a development here of the Homestead Act, and this happened all across the West. So if you see kind of some of the these posters that I'm showing you guys here, they're trying to attract people to come out here. And the reason they have to like try and really attract these people, it sounds like a great deal, 160 acres, but this is really difficult to go out here and farm this land. Remember, they don't have any of the infrastructure out in the West. You're really pretty much on your own out there. And so you don't have a water supply. You have to find a water supply. It doesn't rain that much out there. So you really have to work if you're going to grow crops out there in the West. And to these guys' credit, they're pretty successful at getting this done and creating a thriving farming community out in the West. So much so that the West, the Midwest, what we would call the Midwest now, becomes the breadbasket of our entire country. They're growing corn and potatoes and all these things out west, and it's going to feed this growing eastern population, this new urbanized eastern population out here. Now, another big thing that's going on, they're not just giving land away to settlers. The federal government is also giving land away to railroad companies, and this is a huge part of understanding the West. Railroads play a huge part in the West of closing the open range out in the West and kind of developing this connection between the East and the West. And so the federal government, it's in their best interest to try and promote westward expansion and promote the railroads to connect their western states, Kansas and Oregon, and a few states out there in the West, with their eastern counterparts here. So what they do to kind of promote railroad growth is they don't make the railroads purchase land from the federal government. They just give it to them as they're kind of laying their tracks. And kind of the incentive here was you build the railroads because it's going to be good for America, and we'll kind of work hand in hand with you and kind of uh, we'll give you the land to do it instead of having to purchase all the land. Now, this is good for America because it's kind of developing it and helping to link the country together. But you could also see the flip side to it. This is why some people are going to say, well, the government is on the side of big business. They're working with the railroads, and so it also leads to the railroad being seen as the most corrupt industry in America at the time, and because the railroad also plays this middleman between farmer and eastern consumer, and they're going to charge exorbitant rates on products being shipped east because they're looking to make profits, and they didn't have to shell out the money to buy the land itself. And so all this is kind of going to profit. And so that's how you get people like Vanderbilt who just become these ultimate billionaires at the time. Now, something that I think is really interesting is who actually owns the West. If you look at this map, this is a really interesting map. It's showing you with the red what percentage of land is owned by the federal government in each state. So you really see a distinct divide here. From Texas on over east, those are the lands that are basically acquired before the Civil War, so like 1840s and previous. And if you look here, they're really much driven by having private property out there in the east. There's very small percentages, maybe like the highest one's got like 13% is owned by the federal government, meaning maybe like federal parks or just federal government land. But if you look out in the West is really interesting. Most of these states, almost like 50% of the states, and in some cases, for example, like Nevada, it's almost 85% is owned by the federal government. So we have huge federal land out there. All of our experimentation as far as military is done out in the West, these big western states. We have huge national parks out in the West. And so a lot of it is not even owned by the people out in the West. A lot of the West is owned by the federal government itself, which is, kind of an interesting thing here. We're in a culture where individual property is so prized, and we do have a growing population in the United States. All right, so one of the key authors to understand about this closing of the frontier is a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner, and he writes a book called known as the Frontier Thesis. And he first gives it in a speech to his fellow colleagues. He's a college professor in 1893. Now, we talked about him before, but he's kind of a key guy as far as understanding the frontier and the American mindset. And to him, he kind of puts forth this thesis that the frontier was key to the American development as far as a people, that it offered kind of all the opportunities as far as creating a democracy in America, egalitarian country where there's equality, because every time you move west, it's a chance at a new start. And you can move west in the beginning to the Appalachian Mountains, to the back country, and then to the Mississippi region, and then past the Mississippi, and every time it's kind of a brand new start. And he kind of puts forth this thesis that that's the reason that Americans are so that concept American ingenuity, that we're so creative, that we are able to kind of start over and over again, and kind of build things from scratch. That plays a huge role in who Americans are. And he really kind of tries to compare this to Europe, and he says that's what makes America so different from Europe. I mean, I think today as Americans, we don't really see America as being so different from the rest of the world. But you have to understand, we were very different from the rest of the world. Still in the 1890s, there are no other democracies in the world. There are no other countries like us that are even attempting, equality on the basis that we're attempting equality. Yeah, we fail in some cases. We fail. We don't do the freedmen the justice that they deserve. But at least there are people in America who are trying this stuff. We are a great experiment. And at this time, we're the only country who's really trying this experiment and going out here and trying to do this stuff. And so that's what Frederick Jackson Turner says. And he's kind of saying, like, listen, the frontier is closed. This opportunity is closed. What next? We're a frontier people, America. Where are we going next? So what is going to be the next frontier in our class? Really, America is not going to stop here. In the 1890s, the rest of the world, Europe, these other big, powerful countries, they're already into imperialism. They're taking over countries. And so America, trying to be an emerging world power, we're going to say, okay, our next frontier is to keep pushing the frontier line, to get out there and to try and expand our borders and our influence beyond the continent of North America. The final frontier Well, the final frontier in the 1960s becomes known as outer space. And so again, America in some cases is still a frontier people. All right, everyone. Study for your test. Do not forget